The flag was folded before the sun cleared the tree line. Fort Bragg, North Carolina, January. The kind of cold that does not announce itself, it simply arrives and stays settling into the bones of anyone standing still long enough to let it. The pines along Ardennes Road held their color through every season, indifferent to ceremony, indifferent to grief. They stood the same way they always did, straight, patient, unbothered by what passed beneath them. 21 rifles fired in sequence. The sound rolled across the parade ground and disappeared into the tree line, swallowed whole by the pines that did not notice it. A woman stood outside the formation. She was 25 years old, 5'3", wearing a dark civilian coat that had no business at a military funeral. No rank on her collar, no unit patch on her sleeve. She stood with her hands at her sides and her chin level, watching the casket, the way you watch something you have already said goodbye to. Not with fresh grief, but with the weight of grief that has finished its loudest work and settled into something quieter and permanent. The honor guard moved with the precision of men who had done this before and would do it again. The flag exchanged hands, the final fold, the presentation. The woman did not move to receive it. She waited until the formation began to break. Then she walked forward alone, past the empty chairs, past the scattered programs no one had taken, and she placed one hand flat on the lid of the casket. Her fingers pressed down slowly, like she was checking something, like she needed the physical contact to confirm what her mind already knew. She stood there for 4 seconds. Then her lips moved. Whatever she said, no one heard it. The wind was blowing the wrong direction, and the words were not meant for anyone standing in that field. She straightened, removed her hand, and walked away without looking back. Cut Padu! Red clay dust rising in columns. Fort Bragg Range Complex. July, a heat that pushes back against the body like something with intention. 5 men on the ground, not fallen placed. Each one had arrived at the earth with the quiet finality of something completed rather than something interrupted. Dust still settling over their boots. A stopwatch in someone's hand read 0083, then black, 6 months earlier. The convoy pulled into the forward staging area at 0610, and Sergeant Garrett Decker was already on the observation platform when it arrived. He had a coffee he wasn't drinking. He held it the way men hold things when they need their hands occupied, but their eyes somewhere else. The mug stayed at chest height, going cold. His attention was on the vehicle. 16 candidates dropped from the transport in various states of readiness. Most wore regulation prep gear, tactical pants, training boots. The careful assembly of people trying to look like they already belonged somewhere they hadn't yet earned. They landed on the ground with the particular energy of men who had been told how hard this would be and had decided quietly that they were the exception. Decker had seen that energy before. He knew exactly what it cost. He scanned the group with the economy of someone who had done this long enough that faces sorted themselves in under a minute. He cataloged without thinking posture, weight distribution, eye movement, where each person looked first when they hit unfamiliar ground. Some looked for exits, some looked for authority, some looked at each other, checking the room the way people check a mirror. One of them didn't look at any of those things. She stepped down from the transport last. Civilian boots, dark leather worn at the toe, no insignia anywhere on her clothing. A plain gray top under an unlined jacket. She landed on the red clay and she looked at the horizon. Not the buildings, not the other candidates, not the observation platform where the instructors were positioned. The horizon. Her hands were at her sides. Her breathing was unhurried. She took in the layout of the compound the way a person takes in a landscape they have seen in photographs and are now confirming against memory, not discovering, comparing. Decker lowered the coffee mug. He had a file on everyone arriving that morning. He had read them all the previous night thoroughly without assumptions, because assumptions were how you miss things that later cost lives. Her file was the last one he had opened. It was 7 pages. Most intake files ran between 20 and 30. 7 pages should have meant blank. Unremarkable. A civilian candidate with minimal background, probably connected through some administrative pathway he didn't have visibility into. But 7 pages didn't feel blank. 7 pages felt cleaned. There was a difference. Decker had seen both. Her name was Mara Calloway. He let that name sit in his chest for a moment. It landed the way something heavy lands when you have been half expecting it without admitting the expectation. He had known a Calloway once, served under him. Basra, 1991, when the air was filled with oil smoke and the ground stayed warm underfoot long after the sun went down. Colonel James Calloway, who moved through a combat environment with a stillness that didn't read as calm until you understood it, which took most people longer than they wanted to admit. Decker had understood it in approximately 48 hours. He had spent the following 3 years studying it. That was a long time ago. He watched the woman stand in the January cold of Fort Bragg, looking at the horizon with her father's stillness, and he felt something he had not expected to feel. Not surprise, not professional concern, not the practical consideration of what her presence meant for the program. Disappointment, not in her, in the situation, in whatever had brought her here and whatever she thought she was going to find, and the very high probability that what she found was not going to be what she was prepared for. He picked up the coffee again. Still didn't drink it. Across the compound, Private Nessa Slade had stopped moving. She was 3 positions to the left in the forming group, and she had been in the process of adjusting the strap on her pack when something made her pause. She wasn't sure what the something was, a shift in the air, a change in the collective attention of the group, something her peripheral vision caught without her conscious mind processing it fully. She looked at the woman in the civilian boots. Nessa Slade had grown up the second of 4 children in a household where noise was currency and silence was either punishment or power. She had learned early that the people worth watching were rarely the people making the most sound. She had carried that understanding into the army, and it had served her the way quiet understandings serve people invisibly, consistently, and without acknowledgement. She watched Mara Calloway take her place in the forming group, and she felt the small and unnameable unease of recognizing something she couldn't yet identify. Commander Diane Mercer read the file 3 times. She was not a woman given to reading things more than once. She had run training programs at Fort Bragg for 11 years. She had processed intake documentation for hundreds of candidates. She read efficiently, retained completely, and moved on. That was the system. The system worked. She read Mara Calloway's file 3 times. The first time for content, the second time for what was missing. The third time because she needed to be certain she wasn't manufacturing significance from ordinary incompleteness. She wasn't. 7 pages. Most of the postings vague enough to be meaningless. No decorations, no commendations, no formal training, history beyond basic civilian certifications. The emergency contact section was not blank, it had been redacted. There was a difference. Blank meant no one had filled it in. Redacted meant someone had decided this file did not need to carry that information. Then the last line on page 7. She had almost missed it. It was formatted as a footnote to a clearance reference, the kind of administrative notation that got buried in intake paperwork and rarely flagged anything of consequence. Previous clearance, review. Echo Black archival, status presumed deceased. Mercer set the file down. She picked it up again. Read the line again, set it down again. She had been in this building for 11 years. She had read clearance references from every classification tier available to her access level. She had never seen Echo Black attached to a living candidate. She had seen it twice in her career, both times in archival files, both times attached to names that belonged to people who were by every available record no longer alive. She called Colonel Dana Cross before the morning formation was complete. Cross listened without interrupting, which was her default mode, and the reason Mercer had called her instead of moving up the standard reporting chain. When Mercer finished, there was a pause the length of a person making a considered decision rather than a reflexive one. "Don't do anything," Cross said. "Don't flag it up the chain. Don't reassign her. Don't adjust the program parameters." "And what do I do?" Mercer asked. "Observe." The line closed. Mercer looked at the file one more time, then placed it at the bottom of her intake stack. She went to the window. On the parade ground below, the new cohort was forming for their first assessment. She found Mara Calloway in under 3 seconds. The civilian boots were a reliable landmark and watched her stand in formation with the particular stillness of someone who was not nervous. That was the thing Mercer kept returning to. Not the missing pages, not the clearance notation, not the redacted contact information. The absence of nerves. Every candidate she had ever processed arrived at Fort Bragg carrying some version of visible anxiety, regardless of background, regardless of how well they had been trained to suppress it. It showed in micro-expressions, in the frequency of swallowing, in the way hands processed tension, even when the rest of the body held steady. You could not train it out completely. The body had its own memory. Mara Calloway stood in that formation, and her body remembered nothing to be afraid of. The first week ran the way first weeks always ran, badly, loudly, and with the particular brutality of a system designed to locate and pressure every soft point a person carried. Garrett Decker ran his assessments the way he had always run them. No modification for audience, no reduction in standard based on perception of capability. He had learned the cost of reduced standards once in a way he didn't think about directly anymore, and he had not made that error again. He pushed the cohort through obstacle sequences in the mud and cold of a North Carolina January. He ran time trials on the rifle range. He ran hand-to-hand drilling until people stopped making the faces they made when they thought they were being asked to do something unreasonable, and started making the faces they made when they understood that unreasonable was simply the baseline. He pushed Mara Calloway the way he pushed everyone else. This was not because he had forgotten who she was. He pushed her precisely because of who she was, because there was a protocol for this that existed in no manual and had no official name, and he was the only person in this building who knew it existed. He had learned it from her father. You find the person who matters. You apply the same pressure you apply to everyone, and then you add one additional layer. You make it personal, you make it relentless, and you watch what happens to the stillness. If the stillness holds, you have something real. If the stillness breaks, you have a person who learned how to look still, which is useful in some contexts and fatal in others. He had no interest in people who only looked still. Her responses were consistent to a degree that he found quietly remarkable. When he corrected her form in the mud with language that would have made a reasonable person either defensive or visibly ashamed, she said, "Yes, Sergeant." When he ran her a second time, through a sequence she had completed correctly and told her it wasn't good enough, she ran it again. When he positioned himself behind her during a rifle assessment and made observations about her technique in front of the full cohort, she absorbed it without a single visible response. "Yes, Sergeant. Understood, Sergeant." Even the cadence was deliberate. He recognized the cadence. He had been taught it in a different compound, under a different sky by a man who understood that the human voice was one of the last things a trained person fully controlled under pressure. On day 4, the cohort ran the XM9 adaptive rifle assessment. Field strip clean, reassemble. 15 minutes on the clock. Standard evaluation, standard expectations. Decker positioned himself at the far end of the table and observed without participating. Most of the cohort approached the rifle with the energy of the recently trained, confident at the major components, uncertain at the tolerances, working from memorized sequence rather than internalized understanding. 3 candidates failed to complete reassembly within standard. 1 damaged a component, another completed the task correctly, but in an order that indicated they had memorized a video rather than absorbed the underlying mechanical logic. Mara Calloway approached the table and picked up the XM9 with both hands, turned it over slowly and set it back down. She looked at it for a moment, then she began. Her hands moved with the hesitation of someone consulting an instruction set they were uncertain about. She paused at the barrel assembly. She paused again at the bolt carrier group. Her fingers moved carefully as though each connection required conscious confirmation. She finished in 9 minutes and 40 seconds. Decker noted the time. His expression registered nothing. At the far end of the assessment table, 2 positions to Mara's left, Nessa Slade finished her own assembly and set the reassembled rifle down quietly. Then, without turning her head, she watched Mara's hands. Not what they had done, how they had done it. Nessa had worked as a trainer for 2 years before enlisting teaching compound movements to people in the early stages of building body literacy. She knew the difference between a pause born of uncertainty and a pause born of decision. Uncertainty paused before the action. It hesitated at the threshold. Decision paused after the motion was already in progress. It interrupted itself deliberately mid-movement at exactly the point where underlying competence would otherwise show through. Mara Calloway's pauses were the second kind. At the bolt carrier group, the most technically demanding component of the sequence, the part that revealed most clearly whether someone understood the mechanical relationship between parts or was simply following a memorized order, her hands had completed 60% of the correct movement before the pause arrived. The pause hadn't stopped confusion. It had interrupted fluency. 9 minutes and 40 seconds, third from the bottom of the cohort. Nessa picked up her rifle and returned it to the rack and said nothing. That night she sat on her bunk and ran the observation through her mind, the way she ran everything quietly without urgency, following the logic where it led. If Mara was performing below her actual capability, she had a reason. If she had a reason, it was either protective or strategic. She was managing what people expected of her for a purpose that extended beyond the performance itself. The question wasn't what she was hiding. The question was why. Colonel James Calloway had taught his daughter to shoot before she could reach the top shelf of the kitchen cabinet without a step stool. She had been 9 years old, standing in the scrub desert behind their base housing outside Fort Bragg, both hands wrapped around the grip of a .22 with a shortened stock her father had built for her specific dimensions, and he had stood behind her with his hands in his pockets and talked her through the breathing before he talked her through anything else. Because the breathing is everything, he told her. You can teach someone the mechanics in an afternoon. You can teach them the physics in a week. The breathing takes years. The breathing is where you find out whether someone has patience or just discipline. Discipline is doing it right when someone is watching. Patience is doing it right when no one is. She had learned the breathing. She had learned everything he had to teach the rifle work, the distance calculation, the wind, reading the patience of finding stillness inside your own body and holding it past the point where most people let go. She had learned the close quarters work, leverage principles, the economy of motion that made the difference between someone who had trained and someone who had continued training past the point of instruction into something that lived in the muscle rather than the mind. She had learned all of it between the ages of 9 and 22. And then her father had asked her to promise him something. They were sitting in the hospital room at Womack Army Medical Center. It was October, 2 months before he died, and his hands were the first thing that had started to look wrong. They lay on top of the blanket with a stillness that was different from his usual stillness, a stillness that came from the outside rather than the inside. She had sat in the chair beside him and held one of those hands and looked at it for a long time. He told her what he was asking before he asked it. There was a person he had trained, a good person trained well, all the way down into the parts that don't come back out once they're in. And he had sent that person into a situation with incomplete information, which was a failure of his own judgment, and that person had not come home. He had lived with that for 14 years. He did not want her to live with the version of it that would belong to her. He knew what she was capable of. He knew what that capability applied in a real context cost. So he asked, "Don't use what I gave you to hurt anyone." Not because it would be wrong, there were circumstances where it would be entirely right, and he was not asking her to pretend otherwise. He was asking because every time she used it in a real way, against real resistance, she would carry the weight of it, and he had already given her enough to carry. She said yes. She held his hand and she said yes, and she meant it, and she had kept it for 3 years since through his decline and his death and the 6 months of grief that followed quiet and dense as the January cold at Fort Bragg. She was keeping it now. She was also lying in her bunk at 2300 hours in a barracks room that smelled of machine oil and boot polish, in the residual warmth of other people's exertion, thinking about a report. The report had been filed in 2007 by Major Douglas Strand, then attached to the 1st Special Forces Group administrative staff at Fort Bragg. It had cited Colonel James Calloway for a series of operational decisions regarding a classified mission in eastern Afghanistan, decisions that, according to the report, had resulted in unnecessary risk to personnel and compromised operational security. The report had never been formally investigated. It had never been formally substantiated. It had also never been formally dismissed. It had simply remained in the system unresolved, attached to her father's record, like a splinter that was too deep to ignore and too small to justify extraction. It had not ended his career. He had been too valuable for that. But it had ended his advancement. It had closed certain doors. And in the years that followed, the years of the illness, the years of his decline, she had watched what it did to him to carry an unresolved question about his own integrity. She had watched it work on him the way quiet damage works on the things it touches, slowly, without spectacle. He had never talked about it directly. A man who had spoken plainly about every other difficulty in his life. Combat loss, the weight of command, the grief of outliving people who had trusted you, had gone silent on this one subject. Like it had gotten somewhere too close to the center to approach. She had started looking into the report 6 months before she applied to the program. She had found enough to understand that the original document, the unedited version before whatever administrative processing had happened to the copy, in her father's file was different from what was on record. She had spoken to 2 men who had been present for the events described. What they told her was not consistent with what the report claimed. It was a different story told about the same days, and the difference between the 2 versions was the difference between a man who had made difficult decisions under impossible conditions and a man who had compromised his unit for unclear reasons. She knew where the original report was. It was here, Fort Bragg, in a record system she couldn't access from the outside, in a building she couldn't enter without a reason to be there. She had given herself a reason, 9 minutes and 40 seconds on the rifle assembly, 3rd from the bottom, exactly where she needed to be. On day 6, Nessa Slade approached her after evening chow. She materialized beside Mara in the corridor outside the mess, matching her pace, and they walked together for approximately 30 steps before she spoke. "The Bolt Carrier Group," Nessa said. Mara kept walking. "You were 60% through the correct movement before you stopped," Nessa said. "That's not what uncertainty looks like. Uncertainty doesn't get 60% done first." The corridor ended at a fire door. Mara pushed through it, and they stepped out into the January night. The compound was lit with the orange clarity of outdoor floodlights. The sound of training still drifted from the range. Mara stopped walking. She turned and looked at Nessa Slade for the first time directly. And in the orange-lit night of Fort Bragg, Nessa saw that the look was not calculating. It was for one moment before it resolved back into neutrality, tired. The tiredness of someone who has been holding something in a difficult position for a long time and is suddenly aware of exactly how long. What do you want? Mara said. Nessa considered their question. Nothing yet, she said. I just wanted you to know I saw it. Mara held her look for 3 seconds. Don't mention it to anyone, she said. It was not a request. It was also not a threat. It was the statement of someone for whom the logic of the situation was clear enough not to require embellishment. Nessa nodded once. Go back inside, Mara said. Nessa went back inside. Mara stood in the cold for a moment longer, her eyes moving to the horizon line above the tree line, the same direction she had looked when she stepped off the transport 6 days ago. She thought about her father's hands. She thought about the report. She went inside. 30 yards above the training ground on a second-floor walkway, Garrett Decker stood in the dark and watched her go. He had not been running a time trial. He had been standing exactly there in exactly that darkness for approximately 7 minutes. He had not heard the conversation. He had watched the posture of it. 2 people, one speaking, one listening. One small revelation not escalated. A nod, a withdrawal, and then the remaining person standing alone in the cold, looking at the horizon with the stillness of someone carrying something that belongs to a person who is no longer here to carry it themselves. Decker reached into his left jacket pocket. He touched the piece of metal without removing it, ran his thumb across the edge of it, the way you run your thumb across something worn smooth by years of contact. He withdrew his hand. He looked at the empty space where she had been standing. He had known she would come here eventually. Not to this program specifically, there was no way to know the specific path. But to somewhere that required this kind of access, this kind of proximity to the institutional machinery that had held something in its teeth for 17 years and declined to let it go. He had known because he knew what she came from, and he knew that what she came from did not produce people who accepted unresolved questions about the people they loved. He had known and he had said nothing to anyone, and he had positioned himself in this program in a way that gave him access to her without having to explain that access. He had waited a long time. He looked at the empty compound below him and thought about the last conversation he had with Colonel James Calloway in a hospital room at Womack 4 months before the man died. Calloway had given him something to hold. He was still holding it. The second week began the way the first week ended, cold, unannounced, and without mercy. Fort Bragg in January had a quality of light that Fort Bragg in no other month possessed. It arrived flat and gray through the pines, and it stayed that way until late afternoon, when it didn't so much set as simply quit leaving the compound lit by training lights and the blue-white glare of the rifle range. The candidates had stopped noticing the cold by day 9. The cold had simply become the medium in which everything happened, the baseline condition not worth cataloging separately from the things it surrounded. Garrett Decker arrived at the range at 05:45 on day 10:23 minutes before the scheduled start of the live fire assessment. Master Gunner Walt Pruitt was already there. Pruitt had run the live fire assessment for the selection program for 9 consecutive years, which meant he had stood behind more candidates on this range than he could accurately remember, and had developed over those 9 years a comprehensive taxonomy of what competence looked like from behind at 30 yards. He knew what trained looked like. He knew what overtrained looked like. He knew what the kind of training that could not be standardized into a program looked like, because he had seen it 3 times, and all 3 times it had looked like something he didn't have a clean word for. He was checking the target mechanisms when Decker arrived. They exchanged a nod. They had worked together long enough that words were used selectively, applied only when a nod was insufficient. The candidates filed in at 5:56. Mara Calloway was in the 3rd relay group. She waited her turn with her hands clasped behind her back, watching the first 2 groups run their sequences with the focused attention of someone monitoring rather than studying, checking something against an internal reference confirming. When her group was called to the line, she stepped into the 4th position from the left, accepted the XM9 from the relay assistant, and settled it into the low ready position. Pruitt moved to a position 4 feet behind her right shoulder. This was his standard observation position. Most candidates were focused on the task. Focused on the task meant not fully aware of anything behind them. Mara Calloway was aware of him. He knew this because her shoulders registered his proximity in a way that was too small and too controlled to be instinctive reaction. There was a micro-adjustment, an infinitesimal widening of the base stance that accommodated the presence of someone at her right rear without requiring her to turn and confirm it visually. He noted this and said nothing. The range officer called the line. She raised the XM9 and settled it into the shoulder pocket with a precision that came from somewhere more specific than general training. The grip pressure was distributed correctly, not the way the manual described correct distribution, but the way correct distribution actually expressed itself in a body that had found it through repetition rather than instruction. Her trigger finger rested outside the guard at the exact angle indicating familiarity rather than compliance. Her head came down to meet the sight rather than the sight coming up to meet her head, the difference between a body that understood where the weapon needed to be and a body that was searching for it. She fired the first round, then the second, third, fourth, fifth. Each shot was spaced with a deliberateness Pruitt had seen before. Not the even spacing of a candidate counting intervals because they had been taught to count intervals. The uneven spacing of someone managing their own breath cycle in hold-release, fire, reset, rebuild, working inside a rhythm that belongs specifically to them rather than to a general instruction. The range officer called ceasefire. Pruitt walked downrange himself to retrieve the target. He looked at it for 4 seconds before he showed it to anyone. One hole, dead center of the bullseye. Ragged at the edges the way a single hole gets ragged when subsequent rounds pass through the same point of entry, disturbing the already disturbed paper rather than creating new disturbance beside it. 5 rounds, 1 entry point. The kind of grouping that was not possible in the abstract and was only possible in practice when the variables of breath and trigger press and sight picture had collapsed into a single unified action, when the shooter was not doing multiple things in sequence, but had reduced the sequence to something that felt from the inside like nothing at all. He had seen this 3 times. The first time he had been at Dam Neck running an assessment for a candidate whose name he had later found redacted from every document it had previously appeared in. The second time he had been at this range in 1991 running a qualification for a colonel named James Calloway, who had come back from the Gulf and wanted to run his own scores not for any administrative purpose, simply because he believed a person should know their own numbers. The third time was now. Pruitt carried the target back to the line and held it where the relay group could see it. The candidates to Mars left registered it with the expressions of people encountering something that required recalibration of a previously held assumption. 2 of them looked at her. She was looking at the target with an expression that was not satisfaction and not pride. It was the expression of someone checking a result against an expectation and finding the result consistent and therefore not particularly informative. Decker took the target from Pruitt's hand and looked at it. "Lucky grouping," he said. His voice carried the flatness of a man making a statement he had decided to make regardless of what he thought about it. Not the flatness of someone who didn't know what they were looking at. The flatness of someone who had decided for reasons not available to anyone watching that now was not the time to acknowledge what he was looking at. He set the target on the table and walked back to his observation position. Pruitt watched him go, then he rolled the target carefully and set it aside. He would keep it. He kept things that needed keeping without announcing that he was keeping them. That evening, Garrett Decker sat in his quarters for 40 minutes without the overhead light on. His room was the room of a man who lived practically and stored things deliberately. On the wall above the desk, there were 2 photographs, both framed both at the same height. One was his official service photograph from 2008. The other was taken at Basra in 1991. 6 men, a burned vehicle in the background, the flat, bright light of an Iraqi morning making everyone squint. They were not posed. Someone had called for the photograph mid-operation during a pause in movement, and the men had stopped moving and let themselves be documented without rearranging themselves. Colonel James Calloway stood at the left edge of the group, one hand in a pocket, the other relaxed at his side, looking at the camera with an equanimity that read to anyone who didn't know him as indifference. Decker had learned to read the difference. The expression was not indifference. It was the face of a man who was in that moment exactly where he was not thinking about anything else. Just there, just present, completely inside the single moment of a photograph being taken. It was the same expression his daughter had used on the rifle range that morning when she had looked at a target with 5 rounds through one hole and registered it as confirmation of something already known. Decker sat in the dark and thought about what was owed and to whom and how much longer the holding was going to need to last. He reached into his jacket pocket. He touched the piece of metal and put the jacket back on and went to run the evening session. The hand-to-hand assessment ran on day 12 in the main gymnasium, a large concrete-floored space with mats laid over the hard ground and fluorescent lighting that showed everything without flattering anything. Decker ran the demonstrations himself because he believed that physical instruction delivered by someone visibly capable of the thing being taught was absorbed differently than instruction delivered by someone whose relationship to the material was theoretical. He wanted the candidates to understand in their bodies, before they understood it in their minds, that what was being taught was real. He demonstrated the basic leverage sequence 3 times at half speed, twice at full speed, then paired the candidates and let them work. Most of them worked roughly. They applied force where finesse was available, used speed to compensate for position, and expressed the fundamental misunderstanding of people who had not yet learned that efficiency was the opposite of effort rather than its product. Mara Calloway was paired with Drake. Drake was 28 years old, 212 pounds, and had been a collegiate wrestler for 4 years before enlisting. He moved on the mat with the confident economy of someone for whom weight distribution and leverage were lived experience, and he had spent the first 11 days of the program establishing himself as the candidate most likely to transition from training mode to operational mode without a gear change. He approached the pairing with professional seriousness rather than aggression. That was the right approach. The opening exchange ran textbook. Mara executed the lever point sequence exactly as Decker had demonstrated it, and Drake went down with the clean economy of a man who knew how to fall and wasn't embarrassed by it. He got up, nodded reset. The exchange completed without incident. Decker watched. Not the exchange itself, he had seen the exchange. He watched the 0.8 of a second before the exchange, the micro window in which a person's body committed to its intention before the intention became visible in the movement. In the moment before Mara initiated her weight had adjusted, not the adjustment Decker had demonstrated, which was correct and adequate, but a smaller secondary adjustment that preceded it. A refinement that loaded the leverage point differently and would produce in the actual execution a result that was cleaner and required approximately 30% less force than the demonstrated technique. It was not a deviation from the technique. It was an improvement on it, the kind of adjustment that only appeared after a technique had been practiced long enough that the body began finding its own efficiencies. Her father had taught it to her. Decker was certain of this because he had seen the adjustment before. In a different gym at Fort Benning in 1989, when a colonel named Calloway had watched Decker's third attempt at the same sequence and had walked over and said without preamble, "Move the weight before the move, not with it." He had put his hand on Decker's hip and shifted it by half an inch. The difference had been immediately apparent. It had taken 6 months of practice to build the adjustment into the initial movement until it disappeared as a separate step. 6 months because that was how long it took. There was no shortcut available. Mara Calloway had that adjustment built in. It was not in any manual. It was the private modification of a man who had spent 30 years refining what he had been given into what he had discovered, and he had passed it on to exactly one person. And that person was standing in this gymnasium in civilian boots, performing as a marginal candidate. Decker walked over and told her to use more force and less finesse. She said, "Yes, Sergeant." Her eyes during this correction were the eyes of a person processing a statement in a language they were proficient in hearing the surface meaning without registering it as instruction. She was not dismissing him. She was managing what she allowed to show. He walked away. He was quite certain in that moment that whatever she was doing here, her father would have sent her in exactly this way, through exactly this kind of approach, and would have prepared her specifically for the experience of being pressured by someone who was applying a protocol she had been taught to recognize. Major Douglas Strand announced the reality check drill on day 15 at 2100 hours in the main briefing room after the evening meal and before lights out. He delivered the announcement the way he delivered most things, standing at the front of the room with the posture of a man who had made himself comfortable in the space between authority and performance and found it to be a pleasant place to live. He was 44 years old, medium build, with a face that arranged itself naturally into an expression of calm confidence that read as competence until you had been around it long enough to notice that the expression didn't change when the situation required something other than calm confidence, which was when actual competence normally showed itself. Decker sat at the back of the room and watched Strand's face while Strand talked. The drill was standard in its structure. Survive 30 seconds against 5 of the program's assessment cadre, unarmed without yielding. Pass and you demonstrated the minimum operational standard for the program's next phase. Fail, and you were assessed as not meeting the threshold and exited the program with a notation in your record that would follow the exit. No appeals. What was not standard was the way Strand's eyes moved when he shifted to the candidate selection portion. He had pre-selected one candidate. The standard protocol was random selection or commander's discretion applied broadly. Pre-selection of a single candidate for a punitive framing public assessment was not in the program manual. It was not outside the program manual either. The manual was sufficiently broad to accommodate it, but it was unusual, and unusual procedural choices by senior officers had reasons, and the reasons were not always the reasons offered. Strand looked at Mara Calloway. "Calloway," he said, "you've been marginal across every assessment category since day one. Basic competencies have not consolidated. Physical performance is consistently in the lower third." He paused, the pause of a man letting language do something he would prefer not to do directly. "Let's find out if anything from your background translates to a real situation. 5-on-1, no resets. You're still standing in 30 seconds, we'll note it and move on." The room was quiet. Not the quiet of people who had nothing to say. The quiet of people who understood that what was being said contained something unstated and who were deciding individually whether to name the unnamed thing or let it stay unnamed. Nessa Slade sat 4 positions to Mara's right. She did not look at Strand. She looked at her own hands flat on her thighs, and she ran a calculation that was not complicated but required a moment's honesty to complete accurately. Strand knew who Mara was. He had to know. The selection process for this program passed through the administrative layer of the fort, and Strand was attached to that layer, and a Calloway in a selection program at Fort Bragg was not a name that could pass through administrative layers without catching on something. He knew, and the drill he had just designed and announced with the specific framing and the specific candidate selection and the specific language about civilian background and marginal performance was not a training intervention. It was a removal designed to look like a reasonable training outcome executed in front of 16 witnesses who would remember it as a candidate failing to meet the standard. She had managed her own cover so well that it was now the mechanism of her elimination. Nessa looked up at the front of the room. Mara was looking at Strand. Her expression had not changed from the expression she had carried through every assessment, every correction, every moment of deliberate pressure. But something was different inside the eyes, not the expression around them. Inside them, in the quality of focus, something had shifted from the monitored awareness Nessa had observed for 15 days to something sharper and more specific. The focus of a person who has just watched a variable they were tracking change its value. Then Strand said, "Understood, Calloway," and Mara said, "Understood." Not the way a person says understood when they have processed an instruction and accepted it. The way a person says understood when they have identified a situation clearly and completely and are acknowledging the clarity rather than the instruction. The geometric problem Mara was now inside, was that the drill's apparent legitimacy was exactly what made it effective. She could refuse the drill, which would result in immediate program exit on grounds of noncompliance. She could fail the drill, which was the outcome Strand expected. Or she could pass the drill, which required engaging with 5 assessment cadre at a level that would not permit the deliberate limitations she had maintained for 15 days. 30 seconds against 5 trained men. Not demonstration conditions, not controlled exchange with a pre-consenting partner, a real assessment with real resistance. 30 seconds at the level this situation required meant she could not pretend. That night, the barracks were quieter than they had been at any point in the previous 15 days, not because people had less to say, but because it was the silence of people thinking rather than processing. The specific topic of their thinking was evident enough from the few conversations that surfaced. Short exchanges, low-voiced, that raised the question and set it back down without resolving it. Nessa lay on her bunk and stared at the ceiling and thought about the bolt carrier group pause and the weight shift on the mat and the way Mara had looked at the target after 5 rounds made 1 hole. She thought about what a person had to be carrying to perform the way Mara Calloway had performed for 15 days in service of a purpose that was not the stated purpose. She thought about whether the person who had asked for the promise had fully understood where the promise's ceiling was. She did not have the answer, but she thought Mara Calloway was about to find out whether she did. The morning of the drill arrived with the same flat gray light that arrived every January morning, indifferent to the significance of what would happen under it. Word had moved through the installation the way word moved in closed systems, not through announcement, but through the information network of people who paid attention to each other's movements and drew correct inferences from patterns. By 0800, there were people on the range perimeter who had no administrative reason to be there. Field officers, senior NCOs, 2 men from a different building whose unit patch Nessa didn't recognize. The medics had staged at the near edge of the range with a comprehensiveness that exceeded what a standard assessment drill required. General Roy Kessler arrived at 0812. He arrived without announcement on foot from the direction of the headquarters building. He positioned himself at the elevated observation point at the north end of the range and stood with his hands clasped behind his back, saying nothing to anyone. Nessa saw him arrive. She tracked the movement of Decker's attention and confirmed that Decker had also seen him and that seeing him had produced in Decker a very specific stillness. Not the stillness of a man surprised by a person's arrival. The stillness of a man who had been waiting for a specific thing to happen and had just watched it begin. The 5 assessment cadre were already on the range. Drake, Hess, Merritt, Reeves, Novak. They moved with the ease of people who had discussed the plan and found it achievable. They stretched without urgency and communicated in the abbreviated language of men who had trained together long enough to carry a shared reference without articulating it. Strand stood at the line with a whistle and an expression that did not require interpretation. Mara walked to the center of the assessment area from the equipment bay, and the quality of her movement had changed in a way that everyone present registered and nobody named aloud. For 15 days, she had moved with a deliberate economy that contained itself motion sufficient for the task, nothing beyond. The walk from the equipment bay was different. The containment was still there, but something inside it had been rearranged. The weight was distributed differently. The pace covered ground in a way it hadn't before, and the difference was in where the motion originated. She stopped at the center mark. She had pushed the left sleeve of her training top to the elbow. On the inside of her left forearm, visible in the gray morning light for the first time in 15 days, was a series of small scars that did not originate from a single incident. They were the accumulated record of a body that had been in real situations over a period of years, specific healed, arranged in the non-pattern of genuinely acquired rather than dramatically presented damage. Walt Pruitt, standing at the range equipment station, looked at the scars for 2 seconds. Then he looked at the ground. Strand raised the whistle. He raised it and blew it, and the morning cracked open. Drake came first, 212 pounds, moving at the speed of a man who had been told to end this quickly and had no reason to doubt he could. He came in low with his shoulder dropped, absorbing speed into the approach the way wrestlers absorb speed, building the momentum that made the contact terminal. She was not where he aimed. 8 inches left. Not a retreat, a redirection executed at the last possible moment, where abandoning the approach cost Drake the maximum amount of committed momentum. As he passed through the space where she had been, her hand made contact with the base of the skull, where the neck musculature converged, and the contact was not a strike. In the conventional sense, it was a compression of a small area at a precise angle, and Drake's legs received the information and responded the only way they could, which was by stopping. He went down. Hess and Merritt came from either side on the angle they had coordinated the night before, the correct angle for managing a single opponent who had just eliminated one of 5. The angle was sound. The timing was sound. The problem was that the opponent was no longer in the position the angle had been designed to address. They met each other instead. The collision was not catastrophic, but it was sufficient. 2 bodies whose momentum had been oriented toward a specific point now occupying the same space with that point absent knees and elbows, finding each other in the configuration that coordinated movement produces when the coordination assumption fails. They went down together, and the process of disentangling took longer than the process of going down. Mara was among them before the process completed. A palm contact to Hess's shoulder at the specific angle that transferred force along the limb rather than into the joint left the arm temporarily non-functional below the point of contact. A foot positioned at the correct angle to Merritt's knee joint did not damage the joint. It informed the joint in the language of mechanical disadvantage that weight bearing in the current configuration was not advisable, and the joint accepted the information. 11 seconds, 3 down. Reeves had not moved from his position. He had watched the first 11 seconds with the attention of a man recalibrating. His plan had assumed a sequence. The sequence had not occurred. He was working from observation rather than preparation, now managing the transition between those 2 cognitive states in real time. He was good at this. That was why he had been selected. He moved on a path that was not the path anyone had discussed the night before, on a timing not coordinated with anyone because the coordination was no longer available. He went for the legs, which was correct. Legs were the foundation, and taking the foundation addressed everything built on it. Mara's weight had already moved. She rose above the reach for her legs with a movement that shifted her center of gravity upward rather than back. Not the movement you used to avoid a leg takedown unless you had an elevation option available. She had the option because she had positioned herself beside rather than away from Reeves as he committed to the low approach. The elbow that came down was not descending with maximum force. It was descending with precise force, the amount required to interrupt Reeves's operational capacity without exceeding that amount placed at the anatomical point where that amount would be sufficient. He went down. Her right hand had absorbed part of the contact differently than intended. She knew immediately, not from pain, which arrived later, but from the feedback a hand sends when a bone inside it has been asked to carry a load it can carry, but will remember carrying. A hairline fracture announced itself not as an event, but as information. She registered the information and continued. Novak was the last. He had watched 22 seconds of material that had not been in any plan and was not available in any training reference. He was standing with his weight distributed correctly and his hands in the right position and his mind doing what trained minds did when the training was no longer adequate working. He looked at her. She was standing in the center of the range with 4 men on the ground and her left sleeve pushed to the elbow and her right hand held slightly differently than it had been held 22 seconds ago. She was not breathing hard. Her face held no particular expression. She was looking at him with the attention of a person waiting for him to make a decision, prepared to respond to whichever decision he made. Novak had been in real situations. He had enough experience of real situations to know the difference between someone in front of him who was making a calculation and someone who had already completed one. She had completed it. He stepped back, then another step. I yield. His voice found the register that the body uses when something in it has made a determination the mind is still processing. The range was silent. Mara looked at the four men on the ground. She moved to each one in sequence, checking the way you checked a person you had put down when you wanted to confirm that what you had done was complete and not excessive. Her touch was brief and specific. Assessment, not demonstration. She straightened. She looked at her right hand. It was shaking not from fear and not from adrenaline, but from the neurological response of a hand containing a bone that had just experienced trauma and was sending its report. She looked at the shaking for 2 seconds with an expression that was not pain and not stoicism, but something between them. A private acknowledgement. The face of a person receiving information they had known was a possibility and had proceeded anyway. Then she looked up. She looked at the observation platform at the north end of the range where General Roy Kessler was standing with his hands clasped behind his back. Kessler was not looking at her with surprise, not with the expression of a man who had just witnessed something he hadn't anticipated. He wore the expression of a man who had been waiting for a very specific thing to happen in a very specific way and had just watched it happen exactly as he had understood it would. He walked down from the observation platform. He walked across the range past Drake and Hess and Merritt and Reeves, past Strand, who had not moved from the line and whose whistle was still in his hand, past Novak, who stood where he had yielded, and he walked to where Mara Calloway was standing with her right hand shaking and her left sleeve rolled to the elbow. He stopped in front of her. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a folder. Manila Standard issue worn at the corners, the way documents get worn when they have been handled and replaced and handled again over years. He held it at chest height, not yet extended, held as a man holds something when he wants to establish that the thing is real before he hands it to the person it belongs to. Your father asked me to keep this, Kessler said. His voice was the voice of a man who had been holding a sentence for 17 years and was now releasing it. He told me you'd know what to do with it. The folder was worn at the edges, the way things get worn when they have been carried for a long time by someone who was not ready to act on them, but not willing to put them down either. Mara looked at it. She did not reach for it immediately. She looked at it the way she had looked at her father's hands on the hospital blanket, with the attention of a person registering something that is both expected and at the moment of its arrival, still somehow larger than the expectation. Around her, the range was reassembling itself from what it had been 30 seconds ago. Drake was sitting up, running the inventory a person runs when they return to full awareness after a period of interrupted function. Hess and Merritt had separated and were upright and assessing. Reeves had not moved from the position he had landed in, though his eyes were open and tracking. Novak stood where he had yielded and had not taken his eyes from Mara. None of them spoke. Strand was still at the line with the whistle in his hand. His expression was not the expression of a man watching an unexpected outcome. It was the expression of a man watching an expected outcome arrive from an unexpected direction. Mara had been watching his face since the moment his eyes had found her in the briefing room the night before, and she had understood the difference in the first 3 seconds. He knew what the folder was. He knew because he was the reason the folder had needed to exist. He was the reason Kessler had been holding it for 17 years, rather than routing it through the standard administrative process that would have resolved the question it contained in the weeks after it was filed. The standard process would have examined the original against the filed copy, found the discrepancy, traced the discrepancy to its source. Strand had ensured the standard process did not occur, which had required him to know where the original was and to ensure that the person holding it understood the informal weight of certain informal arrangements. That had been 2007. Strand had been a captain, then newly attached to the administrative staff with the access that administrative attachment provided and the ambition that made access useful. He had miscalculated one thing. He had miscalculated General Roy Kessler. Kessler had accepted the informal weight of the informal arrangement, the way that some men accepted things completely openly, without apparent resistance, in a manner that looked identical to compliance and was not compliance at all, but was simply patience. He had taken the folder, said nothing, made no movement toward the standard process. And Strand had read this as successful resolution and carried that reading for 17 years. The reading had been wrong. Kessler extended the folder. Mara took it with her left hand. Her right was still held slightly away from her body, the posture of a hand that has been given new information and is processing it. She looked at Kessler. How long have you had it? Not a question. She already knew the answer was a long time, and she was asking for the number, the way you ask for a number you need to hear stated rather than inferred. 17 years, Kessler said. She absorbed this a single slow exhale that carried the weight of 17 years of an unresolved question about a man who had died carrying it. He came to me 6 weeks after Strand filed, Kessler said. He had the original. He had retained a copy before the administrative version was routed. He knew what would happen to it once it entered the process Strand controlled. He paused. He asked me to hold it until there was someone with the standing to act on it, someone inside the system, someone who had earned the access. Mara looked at the folder in her hand. He knew I'd come here. He told me you would. She opened the folder. The document inside was 8 pages. First page dated February 2007, bearing the standard header of the 1st Special Forces Group Administrative Staff. The signature at the bottom was Douglas Strand's, neat and deliberate, the signature of a man who had put his name on something with full knowledge of what he was putting it on. She read it the way she had read everything for the past 6 months. Not for discovery because she already knew the general shape of what it contained, but for confirmation, for the specific language, for the distance between what was written and what had been true. The original report did not describe Colonel James Calloway compromising operational security. It described Major Douglas Strand compromising a network of local intelligence assets in Kunar Province to accelerate the timeline of a mission that Calloway had assessed as requiring additional preparation. Strand had overridden the assessment. The mission had proceeded on Strand's accelerated timeline. 2 assets had been exposed. 1 had been killed. Calloway had filed the original report as a factual account. Strand had replaced the factual account or firewall account with a different account, one in which the timeline decision was Calloway's, one in which the exposed assets were the result of Calloway's operational choices. The report that had existed in James Calloway's file for 17 years, the one that had closed doors and ended advancement and worked on him the way quiet damage works on the things it touches, that report described events that had not occurred. Mara read to the end of the 8th page. She closed the folder. She stood for a moment in the January morning light of Fort Bragg Range Complex, holding the folder against her side with 4 men on the ground around her, and Garrett Decker at the edge of the range, and Major Douglas Strand at the line with a whistle in his hand. She looked at Strand. There was between them the silence of 2 people who have arrived from opposite directions at the same awareness of what a situation contains. He knew what was in the folder. She knew he knew. Neither piece of information was new to either of them. What was new was the context. The folder was now in the hands of a person standing on the ground of a military installation with a general behind her and senior officers around her in a situation that had been designed to eliminate her from the installation before she could reach this exact moment. He had been too late. He had known this for approximately 90 seconds from the moment Kessler descended from the observation platform. He put the whistle in his pocket with careful deliberateness and turned and walked toward the equipment building at the north end of the range. Kessler said quietly, "Sergeant Decker." Decker was already moving not toward Strand, but toward the 2 military police officers who had been standing at the range perimeter since 0800, positioned there, at Kessler's arrangement in the location that placed them between the equipment building and the road out of the installation. They converged on Strand before he reached the equipment building door. There was no scene, no altercation, a brief exchange low-voiced, and then the 3 of them walked toward the headquarters complex, and that was the last time Mara Calloway saw Major Douglas Strand. She watched him go. She watched until he was past the tree line, until the space where he had been was simply space again, and then she looked down at the folder in her hand. Kessler spoke before she could form the question she was building. "The formal correction to your father's record will be processed through JAG within 30 days, he said. The language was administrative and precise. The language of official process, the only language that produced official results. Colonel James Calloway's file will reflect what actually happened in Kunar Province in 2006. The falsified version will be documented as falsified with the source of the falsification identified and recorded." He paused. "Not restored," he added. "Corrected. I thought you'd want the distinction." She looked at him. "He told you that," she said. "He told me you'd insist on it," Kessler said. She held the folder and thought about her father lying in a hospital room in October, knowing exactly which words his daughter would want and giving them to a man to hold for 17 years until she arrived to hear them. She had not walked into Fort Bragg alone. She had walked into a structure her father built for her before he died. It was enough. She had not known before this moment exactly what enough would feel like when it finally arrived. Now she knew. It felt like this quiet and heavier than she expected, and completely without the drama she had imagined for it. The investigation moved through the institutional process with the efficiency of things that have been waiting a long time for their conditions to be met. Mara was not informed of its progress directly. She had no formal standing in the proceeding, and the proceeding was internal. She understood this. She had expected this. She found out the way she found out most things in this installation through Nessa Slade, who saw things and said the right amount about them, never more than the right amount. It was the morning after the drill. Mara's right hand had been examined at the medical facility the previous evening. Hairline fracture, fourth metacarpal, consistent with impact to a hard surface. The examining physician had taped it with the practical efficiency of someone who had seen this specific injury often enough to have a preferred technique, and had told her the healing timeline and the functional limitations during the healing period, and had not asked how it happened because the context was self-evident. She was in the mess at 06:30 when Nessa sat down across from her with a tray and a cup of coffee and arranged herself with the economy of someone who had decided exactly what she was going to say before she arrived. MPS went to Strand's office this morning, Nessa said. She said it at a volume calibrated for the space between them, not low enough to be conspicuous, not loud enough to carry. Mara poured coffee. They were there for 40 minutes, Nessa said. Someone from JAG came at 05:40. Strand's name isn't on the afternoon schedule. She picked up her own coffee. She looked at it rather than at Mara. I don't know what the specific process looks like from here, she said. I imagine you do. Mara did know what the process looked like. The original document, now in Kessler's official custody, would be examined against the filed version. The discrepancy would be formally documented. The chain of custody for both documents established. Strand would be afforded the due process the institution provided, comprehensive, deliberate moving at the pace of a system built to withstand pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. It would take months. It would be thorough. At the end of it, the result the evidence supported would be the result the process produced. She drank her coffee and looked out the mess window at the Fort Bragg morning at the pines along the access road, holding their January color. Commander Diane Mercer had submitted a formal addendum to Mara's intake file at 700 that morning. Nessa had seen it moving through the administrative chain. The addendum contained one line. Mercer had written it without instruction from anyone above her, which was either a significant act of independence or the natural conclusion of reading a file carefully enough 3 times to understand what it was saying. The line read, Assessment of Candidate Calloway updated pending review of reference documentation. Previous classification notation forwarded to General Kessler's office per standing protocol for echo-level archival discrepancies. Colonel Dana Cross had signed the forwarding order. That was the chain that had made it possible. Cross had known from day one, had told Mercer to observe, and said nothing further because saying nothing further was the action that preserved the path Mara needed to walk. Mercer had observed. Kessler had held the folder. Cross had signed the forwarding order at the moment it was needed, not before. 3 people who had each done one thing precisely and stopped, handing the thread to the next person and trusting it would be carried. Her father had understood that kind of trust. He had built it into the plan. She thought about that, the fact of being the plan her father had made when he could no longer carry the plan himself. Not improvised, built. Carefully over years by a man who understood that the institutional machinery he was asking his daughter to navigate would require more than her capability alone. It would require access and positioning and people already inside the system who had been told long before she arrived what their one specific task was. Nessa watched her for a moment. Are you staying in the program? She asked. Mara considered this. She had come here for a specific purpose, and the purpose was resolved. What remained was the question of what came after a purpose that had organized a significant period of her life had reached its end. She had not spent much time with that question. She had been focused on reaching this point, and the territory past this point was less mapped. She looked down at the taped hand, the hand that would not return completely to what it had been. She thought about her father standing behind her in the scrub desert behind base, housing his hands in his pockets, telling her that the breathing took years, that patience was doing it right when no one was watching. She thought about a range at Fort Bragg in 1991, where he had run his own qualification scores for no administrative purpose, simply because he believed a person should know their own numbers. She thought about what he had asked her to promise. She had broken it. She had broken it in the way promises break, when the circumstances they were made to protect against have been replaced by circumstances the person who asked for the promise could not have fully anticipated, when keeping the promise has become the mechanism by which the thing the promise was made to protect is actually destroyed. She had broken it in the only way she could justify, which was not because someone had asked her to, and not because she had weighed options and found it acceptable, but because the only alternative was accepting that her father's name remained covered by a lie that a living person had placed there and could be removed. She thought he would have understood. She thought he would have told her she should have found another way. She thought he would have been wrong about that and that he would have eventually known he was wrong, and the grief of losing him before that conversation could happen was going to be with her for a long time. She looked at the taped hand again, not restored, changed. She would adapt to what it was now, rather than working from what she wished it still were. That was what her father had taught her about things you could not change, that the task was not to manage them into acceptability, but to understand them completely and build from what was actually true. I don't know, she told Nessa. This was honest. Nessa nodded once and moved to a different table without announcement, with the instinct of a person who understood when a space needed to be given back. Walt Pruitt was the last person to leave Range Echo that afternoon. Before he left, he walked down range one final time and retrieved the target from the morning's drill assessment, the one bearing the result of 5 rounds through 1 point of entry, the same result as the qualification target from day 10. He rolled it carefully. He had kept both. He did not label them. He did not need to. He knew which was which, and he knew what they documented, and he was the only person in this building whose testimony about what they documented carried the weight of 24 years running assessments for units whose names did not appear in public records. If the time came when that testimony was needed, it was available. He locked the range equipment bay and walked back toward the main compound without looking back. Garrett Decker found her at the end of the duty day. He didn't knock on the barracks door or send word through the chain or leave a note in the standard channel. He was simply present in the corridor outside the common room at 1830 when she walked past the way men of his generation and training were present in places, without performance, without announcement, with the simple fact of being there. She stopped. He was carrying something in his right hand, not presented, not extended, just held, something small, metal. She could see the edge of it catching the fluorescent light of the corridor. He looked at her for a moment, the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere after a long walk and is taking a moment to register the arrival before he does anything about it. Then he extended his hand. In his palm was a set of military identification tags. 2 tags on the standard issue chain with the characteristic dull silver of aluminum that has been carried for many years and worn smooth in certain places by continuous contact with the same surfaces. The printing on the face was still clear. She could read the name before she took them. Callaway James R. She took them from his hand. She held them for a moment, feeling their weight, both the actual weight and the other kind. The chain was warm from his hand. She thought about how long they had been in his pocket, carrying that warmth. Decker said nothing. She turned the tags over. On the back of the second tag, scratched into the metal in small, deliberate letters, the letters of someone who had used a tool not designed for writing on metal and had taken the time necessary to do it legibly, were 16 words. She'll come. Trust her. Don't try to protect her. Let her finish it. J.C. She read them twice. She stood in the fluorescent corridor of the Fort Bragg barracks with her father's dog tags in her left hand and her taped right hand at her side, and she looked at the words her father had scratched into the back of the tag he was wearing when he last deployed. Don't try to protect her. She looked up at Decker. The MPs at the perimeter this morning, she said. That was you. Kessler arranged them, Decker said. I told him where to position them. And Kessler knew to listen to you because your father told him to, Decker said. In 2007, when he brought Kessler the folder, he told him there would be a man named Decker at Fort Bragg when the time came and that Decker would know the positioning. He paused a moment. Your father planned 17 years ahead. I only had to show up. She absorbed this. The plan had not been improvised. It had been built carefully over years by a man who understood that the institutional machinery he was asking his daughter to navigate would require more than her capability alone. It would require access and positioning and people already inside the system who had been told long before she arrived what their one specific task was. Cross had known to observe and hold. Mercer had known to document and forward. Kessler had known to hold the folder and wait. Decker had known to position himself in a program where he could manage the perimeter without managing her. Each one had done one thing. Her father had understood that kind of trust because he had spent 30 years learning what trust actually required, which was not confidence in outcomes, but willingness to carry one specific piece of something larger without needing to see the rest of the pieces. She held the tags and thought about a man in a hospital room in October, scratching words into metal with a tool not designed for it, taking the time to do it legibly, passing it to the right person, and then asking his daughter to make a promise that he knew. Because he knew her, she would eventually have to break. He had asked for the promise because he was her father. He had sent Decker because he was Colonel James Calloway. "Thank you," she said. Decker nodded once to the nod of a man delivering a completed obligation and finding the delivery clean. He walked away down the corridor without looking back with the posture of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and is now no longer carrying it, the subtle recalibration of a body that is built around a weight and now has to find a new center without it. She watched him go. She stood in the corridor for a while with the tags in her hand and the taped right hand at her side, and the quiet of a building full of people who were all in their separate ways inside their own versions of the thing she was inside. Then she went to her bunk and she sat on the edge of it and she held the tags and she said nothing to anyone and no one said anything to her. And this was, she thought, exactly the right amount of silence for what the day had been. At 05:30 the following morning, before the official start of the training day and before anyone else from the cohort had appeared on the range complex, Mara Calloway walked to Range Echo. The light was the light of very early morning in January, thin and specific, arriving without editorial comment, the shapes of things as they were, the distances as they actually were, the ground as the ground was. The pines along the perimeter held their color. The clay was cold and firm underfoot. Her breath came in even measures that were visible for a moment and then were not. The range was empty. She opened the equipment locker with the standard code she had been issued on program entry and looked at the rack of long rifles the program maintained for the advanced assessment phase. She selected the M24, standard sniper system, 24-inch barrel bolt action adjusted for the range's altitude and the morning temperature differential. She had never fired this specific weapon, but she knew its tolerances, the way you know the tolerances of things you understand from the inside rather than from specification. She collected the ammunition she needed and walked to the firing point. She set up with the economy of someone who is not performing the setup, but simply completing it, laying the rifle in the correct position, settling behind it, adjusting the stock for her specific dimensions. She made the adjustments without checking numbers against the standard. Her body told her where the stock needed to be. She settled in. The target was set at the standard qualification distance, 250 yards, the distance at which the program assessed advanced rifle competency and the distance at which the fine qualities of a shooter expressed themselves most clearly. Not the gross competencies which were observable at closer ranges, but the fine ones, the ones that lived in the breath and the press and the stillness inside the stillnesses that her father had described to a 9-year-old as the thing that took years to find. She raised the rifle. She settled it into the shoulder pocket. Her left hand was steady. Her right hand, the taped hand, the hand with the hairline fracture in the fourth metacarpal she placed on the grip. It was not the same. The grip pressure was not distributed the way it needed to be distributed. The fracture was not debilitating, not close to debilitating, but it introduced a variable, a small asymmetry in the chain that ran from the trigger finger through the hand, through the wrist to the shoulder. Small enough that most shooters would not register it as significant. Small enough that at the qualification distance, it would not prevent adequate performance. Not small enough to be absent. She had known this was possible when she made the decision that had produced the injury. She had known it and had proceeded because the decision was correct regardless of its cost, and she still believed this with the clarity that comes from looking at a cost directly and finding it acceptable rather than pretending not to see it. But she was her father's daughter, and her father had told her that a person should know their own numbers. She needed to know her own numbers. She looked through the scope. The target was 250 yards away, clear and specific in the thin early light, without distraction. The crosshair settled on the center. She checked the wind by the movement of the dry grass at the range perimeter, slightly from the left, and made the adjustment without consciously deciding to make it. She breathed in. 4 counts. She held the breath and let the crosshair settle and let everything else that was happening, the cold, the taped hand, the slight asymmetry in the grip chain, the weight of the tags in her jacket pocket, the 17 years and the 8 pages in the corridor and the man who had walked away down it. She let all of it exist without making any of it the subject of her attention. Her father had told her this was what the breathing was for, not to eliminate the things that were happening, but to hold them at a specific distance, far enough that they did not interfere with the single thing that needed to happen in the next moment, close enough that they were still present, because a person who was not present in their own life was not the person who should be trusted with what her father had trained her to do. 7 counts hold. The crosshair held. 8 counts out. She pressed the trigger. The report was clean and single-absorbed by the morning air of Fort Bragg. Without echo, the range designed for absorption, the berms and baffles doing the acoustic work that reduced the sound to a sharp statement rather than a prolonged one. She held the position for a moment after the shot. Then she released the breath she had been holding and let her body return to its baseline, and she withdrew from the scope. She did not look at the target. She cleared the weapon, removed the remaining round from the chamber, returned the magazine to the safe position, and performed the clearance check with her left hand and her right hand working together in the adjusted pattern. She was learning the pattern that accommodated the new information the fracture had introduced, that found the available efficiency rather than forcing the previous efficiency where it no longer fit cleanly. She could adapt. She had known this. Knowing it and confirming it were different things. She stood up from the firing point. The target was 250 yards behind her, bearing a result that was what it was. She would not change the reality of the result by looking at it or not looking at it. The number existed regardless of her orientation toward it. She would know the number when she needed to know the number, and she would work from the number honestly, because that was what her father had taught her about the things you could not change. That the task was not to manage them into acceptability, but to understand them completely and build from what was actually true rather than from what you wished were true. She picked up the rifle, slung it over her left shoulder. She adjusted the tags in her jacket pocket, the small weight of metal that has been carried a long time settling back against her side. She turned and walked toward the main compound. The pines along the perimeter held their color. The light was brightening in the particular way it brightened on clear winter mornings in the Carolinas. Not arriving dramatically, but simply increasing the world, revealing itself by degrees. The range looked the same as it had looked when she arrived. The firing points, the berm at the far end, the target frames at their measured distances holding their positions in the early light, the way things hold their positions when no one is asking them to be anything other than what they are. She did not look back.